My name is my name is Terrell Campbell. I'm an instructor in the college writing program here at Washington University. To, Today we have gathered a panel of scholars from across the university to discuss their approaches to research with you. Just to share a bit of our approach to this, I, along with some of my other colleagues here today, we work within the Writing Identity Pod within the college writing program, and we thought that it would be useful to present to the student body some methods and manners of conducting research with respect to identity. And so we've invited some esteemed panelists whose work is steeped in identity, and we thought that it would be important if they could share some of their approaches to identity and doing identity research, particularly in our classes within the college writing program that are focused on research. Most of our classes are in the midst of conducting research right now, and we thought that it would be great if the students could see some examples of professional research, maybe spark your ideas with regards to your research papers and your projects. So I'm going to stop talking here for a moment and allow the panelists to introduce themselves and tell you a bit about who they are and what their work centers on.
Start?
Yes.
Hello. I'm Casey O'Callahan. I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy and the PNP program. And I guess talk a little bit about what we work on, just a bit. Mm-hmm. Okay. My work is in philosophy of mind and empirically informed philosophy of mind in particular. And I work mostly on sense perception and things like consciousness and self-knowledge.
I guess I get to go next. I usually don't need a mic. Is that true? I'm okay right here? Good. My name is Trevor Sangre. I teach in women, gender, and sexuality studies. Although I think that your question is asking about research that we did. The research that I'm not working as closely with now, but did write on, was actually how do people think about race and class through the Communist Party in the 1930s in the United States. And particularly, I was looking at the pamphlet literature produced by communists and how they talked about race and class as linked ideas.
That was so quick, I was not prepared. So I'm the sick one, so I'm just gonna give that preempt. So if you hear me coughing or something, just get ready for that. But I teach in women, gender, sexuality studies and African American studies. And what I would say my research has been about broadly is the study of what some might call black nonsense. And so what I'm interested in is things that people might deem nonsensical, such as black men who have sex with other men but don't identify as being gay or bisexual, right? Those terms do not translate as appropriate for the way in which they describe their sexual experiences. The work that I'm doing on Kanye West, who is often called nonsensical, and thinking about how that category of being nonsensical and or crazy actually works to dismiss some of the value of both his music and some of his meditations. And then finally, I would say the book that I'm writing concomitantly with that Kanye book, which looks at which is called Disobedient Readings, which looks at what might be nonsensical ways of viewing historically institutionalized structures such as slavery or the black church or these other spaces, right? They've been thought of to be these kind of sacrosanct things that you can't kind of take apart. And I'm practicing disobedience to deal with them and to kind of produce what might be called black nonsense. What's your name? My name is Jeffrey McKeon.
All right. My name is Cynthia Barunas.
Push the button.
There we go. So my name is Cynthia Barunas. I teach in the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. My background is in English, and so I use sort of an interdisciplinary approach to think about the intersections of queerness, disability, and masculinity, and specifically as that relates to 20th century American literature and kind of masculine identified authors. I do a lot of cultural studies as well. I'm thinking about film and visual culture more broadly, but a lot of my research focuses on the ways, and particularly the project that I just came off of, focuses on the way that a kind of series of 20th century male authors kind of using queerness and disability in their work to reframe or refigure narratives about masculinity. We often think about queerness and disability as being something that threatens masculinity, that sort of takes away from manhood in some way. And I was really interested in the way a set of authors had a sort of different vision, and were kind of in a qualified way reclaiming some of those identities for masculinity and seeing sort of what they could do and what they could produce for masculine identity in the 20th century. And so, yeah.
Hello, I'm Patrick Hill. I'm a professor in the Psychological and Brain Sciences Department. And a lot of our work focuses on how people find their direction or their purpose in life. And particularly we do a lot of studies with adolescents and emerging adults who, through finding out who they are, whether it's their sexual identification, racial identification, cultural identification, like understanding kind of who they are and what their identities are across these different domains. How does that help them to identify what kind of path they want to take, and how identity-relevant experiences help to set those goals for life that carry them through into adulthood and beyond. So.
Okay, is that working? Yeah, that's better. So my name is Dylan Brown. I'm a professor in the English department. I also technically have affiliations with comparative literature, African American studies, and American culture studies. My research is based in the Caribbean, so I write about Caribbean literature. And I mean, the Caribbean is sort of always caught up in issues of identity because it comes from imperialism, colonialism. I don't know what's going on with mine. Yeah, do I have to just practically, what do I need to do to make this work? Okay. It's going in and out. Okay. All right, let's try somebody else's. Well, whatever, I can probably talk without a mic, right? Whatever the case, so that colonialism structures the experience of identity in the Caribbean, and that's mostly what I work on. It's issues of race, issues of ethnicity, issues of authenticity, actually, because the questions become, who can you be if you've been brought up in a system that is essentially foreign to your self-understanding, and that's what I work on. So.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you all for the brief introductions there, right? We have some questions that have been thrown around in the department by the students, by some of the faculty, and I would like to read them and have you all respond to them. I don't want to start with the same person every time, so do not let me start with the same person every time, okay? But I want you all to get a chance to chime in, right? Okay, so the first question that we have is, how has your own personal or cultural background influenced your your research? I'm sorry. That is, how has your own personal or cultural background influenced your research?
I started last time.
Okay, Trevor.
That was totally legitimate and also kind of sneaky.
It was, wasn't it?
Because I was really counting on someone else going first so that I could think about how I wanted to answer that question. I want to tell you a story. So I started my graduate degree and I knew I wanted to write about social movements, and I knew that I wanted to write about left social movements, and I approached my advisor, who's trained as a historian, and I knew that I'd probably be doing some historical analysis, and I proposed these things that I wanted to write about, and she looked at me straight in the face and she's like, you have no distance. You must look somewhere else to start framing your questions. And I was heartbroken and really mad at her, which I think is a perfectly reasonable response, and decided to start other places and look for other things because I kind of had to do, to some extent, what she told me, and found that that was really useful. So I had come in having done queer activism for a couple of decades at that point, and or a decade and a half, I'm not that old, and really wanted to write about that, but was tied up in not being able to get a lot of distance. And using a historical method, distance is one of the things that we privilege in history. And so I just started looking for other places that had similar questions of how do identities relate themselves to and push against the state, which I was interested in thinking about queer things, and stumbled upon the Communist Party and their thinking about race in the 1930s, and found that I could think better about questions about queerness because I could understand how those questions might be similar and different to other groups across time.
Jeffrey?
No, it's just a very interesting kind of direction. So I like going with the story, so I'll go with the story too. When I came into graduate school, I knew that I liked ideas. I just evaded any idea that had to do with sexuality. And one of the reasons was because I was not a person who felt like when I was an undergrad and when I was in my master's program, that the way in which particularly white gay men were assigning labels to themselves or building communities of sociality or social worlds were enveloping me. They were inviting me as a black young man from, at that time, young man, still young man, from Chicago. And when I got to graduate school, which was back in Chicago, I went into my dissertation advisor's office, and he was like, it was like my second or third year in graduate school, and he's like, okay, now you've been toying with this idea of doing a hip hop project, but you know, that's old hat. You can't write about hip hop anymore. There have been 20 books written on hip hop and all that stuff. And I was like, yeah, you're right. You know, of course, 20 years later, I would wind up writing a book on hip hop, but not on hip hop though, but about kind of black genius in hip hop. And so I told him, I said, I don't want to do anything having to do with sexuality. He said, who are you fooling? And he said, what do you mean you don't want to do work on sexuality? He was like, everything you've been thinking through and writing through and like working through in your own life, right, is about the very unique sexual position or subject position. I was trying not to use jargony language, but subject position of folks who disidentify with categories that have been given to them. And so it seems to me that you're very interested in black men who don't identify with being gay or bisexual. And you know there's this article about men on the DL that just came out in 2003. You should read this. And I was like, interesting. Don't know. I don't know what I'm gonna do with this. And so what happened was I talked over with friends and they were like, oh yeah, I met this guy who said he was on the DL on the party line. Oh my God, I met this guy on the DL at the time, Steve for Steve. You know, I met this guy on the DL when I went to DC. He didn't want to be seen out in public with me, but we just, you know, whatever. But, you know, I was in a relationship with this guy on the DL. He never wanted anybody to know that we were together, but we were roommates. Right? And I was like, oh my God, all these people have experiences. And I was like, huh, let's do some interviews. So I got an IRB, did some preliminary interviews, talked to some people, not my friends, but some other friends of friends, right? So people who connected me. And that began the kind of investigation or interrogation of men who have sex with men who don't identify as gay or bisexual.
All right. There we go. Yeah, so I feel like I have no, I don't really have a story to tell. And I don't really have a history of avoidance of sort of these topics that I've been interested in. I feel like I just sort of jumped kind of full force, like as soon as I started my undergrad. Like I wanted to think about literature from the perspective of feminism, from the perspective as a queer woman. I just, you know, I wanted to think about the representation of women and the representation of queerness and learn all I could and study it from that lens. I think the interesting kind of movement for me has been realizing that, as you begin to study some marginalized identities, it leads you into other marginalized identities, right? Some identities that you don't occupy. As I was sort of gravitating towards literary texts that, presented, that were thinking about questions of gender and thinking about questions of queerness, and particularly I think I was really gravitating around like Southern Gothic literature at that point in my life and thinking about, Carson McCullers and just like different authors who were really looking at that intersection. I began to be interested in disability in terms of their representation of sort of kind of like physical difference, and kind of how differences of gender and differences in sexuality were sort of manifesting in their characters' bodies. And I think, as a non-disabled person who's thinking about disability, right, this opens up a whole other set of questions and a whole other set of responsibilities. Because oftentimes disability, as disability scholars will sort of, many of which argue, oftentimes it just gets used as a literary device. It sort of flattens out the experience of disabled populations to just sort of use this as a metaphor for alienation or cultural isolation. And so an important movement for me was in grad school, sort of studying with disability scholars, being exposed to the right literature, reading the voices of disabled scholars and the questions that they're raising, and realizing that those questions were very different than the questions I was raising as an undergrad, as I was sort of, kind of moving into this sort of other identity category. And so I think that's sort of one thing that has been interesting for me, is to think about what identities I occupy in relation to what I'm studying, what identities I don't occupy in relation to what I'm studying, though they are nonetheless intersecting, and how we can sort of think about sort of that closeness and also that distance, and think about what privilege you're bringing to the texts, and and I would say really emphasizing reading the voices of those who, if you're studying, an identity category that you are not identified with, really thinking about what conversations are happening within that field, and taking the responsibility to familiarize yourself with that as you explore those intersections.
I'm going to say something similar, only not nearly as eloquent as that was, in the sense that I think a lot of what I've learned is the need to go out and the need to kind of explore in person or talk with individuals of these the different identifications that we work with. That as one example, we do a lot of research on like the health and well-being of psychological well-being of individuals of different potentially marginalized groups. And one master's thesis we were working on looked at the psychological well-being of individuals who identify as like Native Hawaiian, and that meant, like, this always sounds like a joke, like, well, I had to go to Hawaii to do research, and it's like, oh, geez, you had to go to Hawaii to do research, and it's like, but it really was this really impactful experience that you realize the importance of going out and talking with individuals in the community that you are trying to work with, and it really reshapes a lot of our research because, this one identification is kind of like someone who does psychology research. We want to give these questionnaires that are like, okay, the same items to each group, and how strongly do you identify with X, and okay, 1 to 5 scale, move on to the next item, and so forth. And you realize how quickly that once you work with these different groups and work with across different identifications, that these items are, I don't want to say meaningless because that kind of throws out a lot of my research, but it means so many different things to different groups, and we've really realized the importance of also like participatory research, of knowing what we don't know and talking and having focus groups with individuals as we create these questionnaire packets. And I guess that's, getting back to your question, my background in identity has taught me what I don't know about identity in a lot of ways. So. Yep,
so we're running through the list. Is that how this works? Okay. All right, well, I got a short, sweet answer. I mean, I study Caribbean literature, and I'm a white guy from Kansas, so my personal identity has very little to do with what I study. So Trevor's advisor would probably actually really like that, because I'm very distanced from it, and I like Pat, sorry, I was going to call you Tim. That would have been good. Pat, Tim, call me what we want. I definitely need needed to go to the Caribbean to experience it, and I don't like qualify immediately in most people's minds as an authentic expert because of my identity, which just sort of drives me to actually be an expert by virtue of doing the work to know about what's going on. So I think, it's posed some obstacles, but it's also proven fortuitous in some ways, because it really is a motivating factor not to be caught out. And I can apply some parts of my life, of course, to aspects of theirs, but in general, I'm definitely an outsider for the most part to what I study.
So I don't work on anything specifically focused on identity. In the work that I do, try to think about aspects of human existence that are pretty universal. So this is I think that very idea is challenged in lots of places in the contemporary academy. And the very idea of that kind of enterprise has come under attack from a lot of different directions, and so there's a lot of ways in which it's kind of a fraught enterprise. I also, it's not the case that I work on from a standpoint that addresses a particular aspect of identity either. So, thinking about things like consciousness and sensory perception and self-knowledge, again, are things that I hope pretty much anybody who lives in this world can appreciate, resonate with in some way or another. Now, lots of details about my own personal background led me to the interest that I have, and in some ways, a lot of that was transparent to me for a long time in my career, and this is one of the things that happens as you progress along and learn, really, as you start to reflect in more detail about how your identity shaped what you do. And I don't think there's there's not a neat story. I think one thing that I've actually thought about and batted around in my own mind for some time is the fact that so I grew up in a sort of working class, relatively poor town in southern New Jersey, with a bunch of carpenters and fishermen and that kind of thing in my family, and did pretty well academically and had some success in a way that nobody else from my community did, and very much felt like an outsider there, and had a kind of self-narrative of sort of working hard and coming up through things and making it, and at some point that really confronting my own privilege and all of the ways in which I had opportunities that are not open to other people, and did not face challenges that are faced by large parts of our community in this country and in this room. Those are things that just increasingly became evident to me over time, and so this isn't in my research per se, but my field is historically very white and very male, and finding myself in the position that I am with my identity and background, one of the things that shapes my work, not necessarily my research, but my work as a university faculty member with tenure and all the good stuff that comes with that, is trying to make my field more open and a more hospitable and welcoming place for people who do have quite different backgrounds and identities. And, that means very differing kinds of perspectives on the questions that I've worked on in my career. Very different from the kinds of ones, very different ways of approaching those problems from the ones that were prevalent when I was in school and in the first part of my career.
Thank you. Our next question centers on, what do you all think makes a good research question? What do you think makes an original research question? What do you think makes a research question worth exploring? And how do you know when you found a good research question? So this centers on selecting a research question. How do you all settle upon a research question? And how do you know when you have a good one? We'll start with Jeffrey this time.
Was not expecting that. Actually, my question was going to be, do you have to answer each one?
They might not have to answer each one.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go for what I work a lot with graduate students on, and when I was directing the Mellon Mays undergraduate program, which is the premier program here for underrepresented minority students who want to pursue PhDs and kind of pursue the life of the mind. When I was doing that, I would have this question all the time. It's like, how can I create an original research project? What is my original research question? How do I know it's original? And my question always is, have you read? And they're like, well, I read this and I read that. I said, well, then how could you know? They're like, wait a minute, I have to read more? I'm like, yes, you have to read more. Because the idea of producing a question, right, is like producing a play, right? Everybody has seen the plays that are about the lovers who are star-crossed and die. Not original. Right, but have you seen that one? The one with the star-crossed and then they actually are in space and not on Earth? Right? And then you realize, okay, well, that's what it is, right? And so with my students, I always ask them, I said, have you read? That's the first question. And then the second question I ask is, okay, if I'm dealing with a more mature student who's read a lot, and we've been working together for a while, I'm like, okay, so you've come to this question now, which is, how do Martinician women navigate sex work? Okay? Oh, interesting. It's a very interesting question. A couple people have written about this. You would be the third person. So the question is, what are you augmenting? Like, how are you augmenting the questions that have previously been asked? Right? How do you augment it? So that's kind of my very quick answer to that.
Yeah, that is a great answer, and I feel like I'm going to be echoing it on some level. I mean, I think, maybe just another way of phrasing it is just know the conversation, right? Your research question is your contribution to the conversation. I think we don't often think of questions as part of conversation because we think of it as a question that has an answer and that we can just come up with that question in a vacuum, and it doesn't emerge in a vacuum. Questions come out. I think if you frame your research question as what is my voice adding to the pre-existing conversation, it's a helpful way, because then the question really is what hasn't been said yet. Where are the gaps, right? What's missing? And I think if you're truly plugged into the conversation, that becomes clear to you, and it feels a little less intimidating than just sitting down with a blank screen being like, what question do I want to ask, right? Letting that sort of emerge as part of your sort of deep dive into all of the literature on the subject that you're interested in, maybe and sort of trusting that it will come. It might take a minute or two or several weeks, but it will emerge for you because if you're interested in the topic, then your brain cells will be firing around everything that you're reading. And so I think just figuring out how to situate yourself in that dialogue. I advised an honors thesis last year that I think is sort of a great example of this, of a student who wanted to write about chronic illness, but she wasn't sure exactly, you know, kind of what her approach was going to be. And after she read a lot of stuff in disability studies, you know, she sort of realized not just sort of kind of her original question was like, well, why isn't this being talked about? And then she sort of eventually formulated a question about sort of, you know, why is this difficult to talk about, right? What is it that keeps people from being able to, what are the assumptions that keep people from thinking that chronic illness is something that we can, you know, express, right? And because she saw in the literature that, you know, oftentimes people are saying, oh, well, this is inexpressible, right? No one can, you know, communicate their pain to somebody else because it's so personal, right? And so her question sort of emerged, you know, what is it about the inexpressibility of pain, and how can we think about that differently? And so, yeah, I think just really, I mean, again, I think this is just a version, you know, of what's been said already, but, you know, just familiarizing yourself with the conversation, I think sort of just takes some of that intimidation factor out of it, and just letting it sort of come as a response to what's been said before you.
I feel like we're going to say the same thing as the last two, but yeah, I think two of the things that really come to mind, particularly reflecting on the last two responses, like I get a lot of students, so I've mentored a lot of senior theses and so forth, and I get a lot of students who come in like, oh, I've got this great idea, but so-and-so's already done it. Like, we always get people who have read like, oh, this one paper did this one thing and it's already been done, so my entire thesis is gone and ruined, and like they get very sorrowful and sad. And I think kind of, as was previously said, what is it that you can do something new? And in fact, I think a lot of the time what I try to tell students is that's amazing. Like like it's really great that so-and-so did this idea. Like that's showing that that's an interesting topic for the literature, that it's something that people are intrigued by, but also there's always something you can add to that previous study, that previous research. And I think the thing that I keep coming back to when I advise students on how to find their research topic is it's really got to be something that's intriguing personally to you. There are so many times we see students who have been just basically given their project by the professor, like, okay, you're going to use this data set, you're going to find if X predicts Y, and they barely make it through the year because they're so bored or disillusioned, and it's a lot to write this very lengthy paper or to really get engaged with the topic when it's something that's just been given to you. So what we try to do a lot is have the students begin with, you know, a big picture, like, oh, I'm interested in college student well-being. Great, okay, what part of college student well-being? Here's like 3 or 4 papers, and then they come back and read all of those, and again, like, okay, now I'm interested in college student well-being during the transition to college. And moving it incrementally along is particularly important. That it has to be something really engaging to you. And I guess one thing that I've learned in my interactions with students is also, like, don't be afraid, kind of backtracking on the previous question, to have it be something related to your identity. That we have a number of students who sometimes are afraid to like talk about whatever their identification is or whatever is personally like guiding them, because they don't think it's scientific enough, or they get kind of upset or worried about how it's going to look to the empirical literature, or when they're presenting at a conference. And a lot of the time we tell them, like, well, no, that's exactly, like, that's going to be the topic that you really want to present at a conference, or the thing you're going to be most engaged in. So don't get disillusioned or worried about trying to find something that fits, or something that might be more accepted. Find something that really is meaningful to you, and that's going to be the best topic for you, for your research idea.
Should we keep it? I mean,
Yes.
I don't have much
You
to
don't have
add
much
to
to
that. I
add?
mean, I think it's true. Like, thinking of it as a conversation is important. And obviously, as you're coming to the end of the semester doing a research project, you better be excited about it in some fashion. It should be a question you are curious about, something that you actually want to pursue, or else you really won't do a good job or even get it done. So, I mean, I think to my mind, what they said is exactly right. Follow your reactions to what you read and sort of just pursue those until you find another question. But yeah, I mean, I think if you're enthusiastic and genuinely curious about answering the question, then it should be a good one.
You all want a different question?
Oh, this one. Definitely, you have to be excited about it. Academic work can, it can get boring, and it takes a lot of effort and attention, so you want to make sure it's something that grips you. So that's just to echo that. The other thing that I try to push my students to do is to answer the question, why does it matter? And it's the hardest question in all of academic work. And it's been pressed on me numerous times. I always find it really annoying at first. But why does the question matter? What hangs on it? And I think there's like two broad ways to answer that question. One is just in general. Why should people in general care? So if you're thinking about explaining it to your parents or your friend or a sibling, somebody who's smart that you can talk to about that stuff, but doesn't have a background in the field. Can you get them to understand why it matters? And then the second is in the field itself, and I think that connects up with some of these other things. So, what hangs on it within the conversation that's happening in that field. And so these are kind of two ways of answering that question. If you can do that really clearly for yourself, then I think you'll have a very nice research question.
I want to answer the question too, mostly because I want to be a little bit contrary. Not that I think that my co-panelists have not given great ideas, but a lot of the framing of them were talking about like senior research projects, seniors honors theses, a big research project, where you have ideally more than a couple of weeks to put together your research project. And my guess is that you're all working on research projects where you have tops 5 weeks to go. Because you're not necessarily taking it farther than this class, at least right now. And then what do you do? Because a lot of these answers are awesome, but you can't read everything in the discipline. And therefore, they might have seemed really overwhelming. I got scared listening to some of my esteemed colleagues over here. So my suggestion would be dig in. You can't know everything. We don't know everything, even if we pretend to. It's a lie. You can't read all the books. You can't know everything that's been written about a subject.
Yeah.
So dig in, find something and go tiny, because a tiny research question enables you to write so much more than some big thing that you're trying to wield. So yes, ideally you read. Reading's fun. But if you can't read everything, because you can't read everything, dig in. And then the other thing is that while I appreciate write about something that you're passionate about, there are also, you don't have to. There are things in my life and my identity that I'm not willing to write about. Because I think the ways that people write about them most commonly in the academy are sickening, and I don't want to participate. So, it's kind of blunt. So know that you can choose to, but you also don't have to. That there are other ways to approach these things as well.
Can I respond?
Please,
that was
please.
great. I'm glad that we need contrarians on all panels, but I also think that was just totally appropriate. And like, I'm thinking about my students in class with me now who have decided to write a paper, and I was actually walking with a student today, and I could feel their kind of angst and anxiety, and they were like, it's been Kuhn, I gotta figure out something new, so I'm gonna come up with a new theory. Bam! Right? And I was like, actually, you know what? Just you dealing with Willow Smith as a figure and talking about the queerness of Willow Smith is just fucking exciting. And I said, I don't even care what you do with it. Like, talk about her hair, whip your hair, do whatever you want, and then connect it to, you know, of course, larger questions in Black studies and women, gender, sexuality studies. That's perfect. But there is also something about, and we don't want to forget this, right? There are also subjects that just have not been covered because people have dismissed them as nonsense, right? And that you know, like for example, I used to do the Japanese liaison for Chicago Public Schools, and my students would always talk about like, you know, we love K-pop. And they were like, but we can't write about that. And I was like, why not? Like, why can't you write about K-pop? Like, there's something about this kind of transnational, co-shared culture that we don't talk about. And now, of course, 20 years later, right, what are folks doing in, you know, Asian American studies, the transnational Asian studies? They're talking about K-pop and the way in which it circulates multiple kinds of ideologies, including capitalism and including like commercial beauty, right? So there's all these things that can be done. So I agree with you. I think that sometimes you gotta just rest on the fact that, oh, I like this topic. It was really cool, and I haven't seen anybody talk about, you know, Willow Smith. Fun.
I want to read about Willow Smith.
See.
Right.
Some of you have touched on the next question, but I feel that we must ask it because it's most centered on our students. The question is, what's the one thing you wish students would do when preparing research papers that they often don't do?
I get to go first on this one, huh? I'm not sure I have a great answer to this question, but I do think the thing, I guess, that I see most often, I mean, and of course every student is different, but in collecting research, I think there is a tendency to get swallowed up by what you're reading and just sort of report on the different sources, right? You know, and of course, you know, you've all learned or are learning about sort of analysis and synthesis and sort of using sources together, but I think that is a difficult leap to make from just, you know, this person said this really smart thing, well, so what do I have to add to that? And this other person said this really smart thing, and it becomes just sort of a patching together of really smart things that other people have said, figuring out what your argument is, and I think this relates to the previous discussion about finding your research question, right? Finding what you are contributing to the conversation, right? What somebody can learn about the topic that they can't learn from doing, you know, kind of a bunch of searches, or that they can't learn from just reading what you've read, right? What are you doing that is unique? And I think that is the hardest part, and I think that is the thing that I see students sort of struggle with the most, is figuring out, you know, and you know, I think a lot of that comes out of passion for the subject. You know, I don't think this is like laziness. I don't think this is, I think this is really like you get into it and you're so excited by what you're reading. You just want to like, you know, sort of talk about all the things that you're reading. I know that when I was writing my dissertation, you know, the first chapter that I wrote, I ended up like, you know, writing like 20 pages about pirates that had nothing to do with what I was talking about, or that I thought had something to do with what I was talking about, but I just, like my advisor recommended a book and I read it and I was like, oh, this is like connected to what I'm doing, and, you know, and then you're just sort of off. You know, you know, and I think in that meeting he said, I still remember he said, okay, which toy do you want to take out of the toy box? Like that's kind of like, and I think about that sometimes still, like how to narrow it down, how not to let this spin out of control. Which sources are you prioritizing? Which maybe are you footnoting? Which ones, because you can't do everything. And I think there's that sort of initial passion, like you can do everything, but just sort of knowing that you can't. And kind of like which toy do you want to take out of the toy box? Which ones are you going to keep in there? And how is that going to then help you to, and I think that's sort of the key to then being able to fashion your own argument about it, is sort of narrowing the field so that your voice isn't just lost in this and kind of swimming in, you know, inside of your research, right? How are you controlling your research?
Similar to that point, I guess the two things that kind of come to mind are related to speaking in your own voice in terms of, we get a lot of papers in which somebody has come and like quote, like, there's absolutely no way I could ever put this phrase or this sentence or this thought into better words than so-and-so did years ago. So they come up with like an entire, they had a paper that out of a 3,000 word paper, I think 1,000 words were quotes. And it's like, that's not the way to go for the document, that it doesn't speak to what you're interested in or speak to your perspective on things. So I think even, the thing we kind of tell students a lot is like, it doesn't have to be perfect prose. It doesn't have to be like, but it has to be kind of your voice and your prose. That on the opposite end of things, there's a lot of times where students will come up with like thinking that they have to sound academic in a way, like really putting forward, like I was just reading a paper today in which somebody's like, the burgeoning of research has shown, and part of me is like, is burgeoning a noun? I kind of like it as a noun. I'm not sure. I might use that in the future, but it's like, no, just say previous work has demonstrated or something like being straightforward, having clear words that you actually use is the best way that you're going to get your point across rather than trying to sound really fancy or use all your GRE words or trying to quote exactly what the previous sources have done. Both of those ways are going to just lead you to a paper that's not you and not something that you're actually putting forward as your own interest in your own work.
I mean, my initial response is definitely the same thing. I don't want you guys to be taking the sources that you use as a sacred text, right, and already the truth, so that you don't have anything else to say. And that seems to me the biggest problem that people who are starting with research have, is getting colonized by the thoughts of other thinkers in print. Just because it's in print doesn't mean it's true, doesn't mean you can't disagree with it. So you should make sure you distance your own thinking from the thinking that you're quoting. There's numerous strategies for doing this, but you should always have an opinion about what you're reading, and you should always have something to add if you're going to include it in your paper. You can agree with it and add to it, right? I mean, that's one of the easiest ways to augment. Somebody used that word earlier, which is just to sort of take it in a different direction or apply it to a slightly different situation or something like this. That's one good way. You can also disagree with one component of what somebody says, and that's another way to establish a distance. And I know in the writing one, you guys have been working on arguments the whole time, so you want to make sure that argument stays right down the middle of what you're writing. Every paragraph should be about that argument. It shouldn't be about all the extraneous stuff that you've read. So that's what you need to narrow it down to. And anything that doesn't fit, you can put it back in the toy box, or put it in a footnote, which is always the academic way of saying, yeah, I read this, but I don't think it's important enough to include in my main body of my text. Just trying to think. I mean, one other strategy I always use with my students is when you read a critical article in particular, if you can summarize the argument in a sentence, then you'll be able to sort of think around it a little bit. You'll be able to address it from different angles, have it as an object of critique in your mind rather than just the words that you're quoting. And so I think that's probably all I need to say.
The most common thing that I see in student papers is, suppose it's a 10-page paper. There's 8 pages of writing talking about what other people have said or what somebody's argument is, and it might be a critical discussion, a nice critical discussion. And then there's a page or two at the very end with a really exciting, kind of promising, crackling idea that sounds unique and distinctive to that student. And my advice is always that's your paper. Make that the paper. And what that usually involves is taking all that 8 pages of wind-up and condensing it down into a couple of paragraphs, a paragraph or two, maybe a page or two, as the framing and setup, and then stating and unpacking and clarifying and dwelling a bit in your idea, and saying in more detail what it is, anticipating some responses to it, incorporating them into your own discussion as a way of complicating your own view. So that's usually the best paper you could write is there contained in that last page or two. And that's, I don't know, probably 3/4 of the papers I read from students.
Could I ask for the question to be read again? Because I think I have an answer, but I am not sure it's to the right question.
What's the one thing you wish students would do in preparing research papers that they don't often do?
Okay, so the question is what I thought it was. Write more. I think that a lot of my students that I'm working with little research papers, with big research papers, start reading and get stuck in the reading and are going to read forever because reading feels a lot safer than putting their own ideas on the paper. And again, I'm trained as a bad historian because I'm not really trained as a historian, so none of the historians would consider that I'm a historian. I'm a bad historian. And as a bad historian, one of the things that I could do is that every time I was going to do research, mostly in archives, is that in archives where I was not allowed to have pens because delicate things, and so I had my computer, is that I would have a text in front of me and I would be writing down as many things as I could possibly do, and it was ugly writing. It didn't make sense, there was no periods, there were lots of dashes. Dashes are always bad. And so, but it was tons of words. And it was those words that inevitably became the things that I could say later. And one of the things that was beautiful, because I was in an archive where I couldn't take pictures and I couldn't have a pen, it was very draconian, that I got the best research out of that experience because I was forced to immediately go to what I thought. I did some summary, I definitely wrote down some quotes, but I was forced to do my own thinking and put my own thinking down kind of all miggly-piggly. And that was really productive. So I wish my students would write more. Write ugly stuff that you would never turn into me to start fleshing out those ideas so you can get crackly ones. Because more crackly ideas.
Do you have anything to add, Mr. McCoon? Okay. Well, we have reached that point in the panel here where we will open up questions to the crowd. So if you all have questions, please pose them to our panelists. And
Did you plant any? Any of you plants out there?
we didn't make any plans, we just.
We don't bite. Any questions? A good question.
All of you all have perfected research approaches out there. All of your methodologies are working for you excellently. Yeah? Yeah. Okay. Well,
There's one in the back.
we got one.
I have a question about, I feel like we need sometimes to, so I teach right now, they teach a different topic. And I feel like we sometimes take it for granted as instructors that students know how to do close analysis. So, when we tell students to dig in, we know that means look closely at a text. And when we tell students to read widely and then form the research question based on something that's that feels like it needs to be asked, that they know how to go to the literature and support that with close analysis. But how do you teach analysis in your, how were you taught analysis as students? How do you teach analysis? I mean, close analysis is just, to me, what helps you flesh out your ideas in your papers and your work. It's not just the research question, it's the analysis that leads you to the questions, analysis that supports the answers. So how do you deal with the problem that analysis is a very hard thing to teach, and analysis is a hard thing to learn?
I'll bite. So, I think when you assign a big hunk of reading, an article length, or, a couple chapters of reading, when you come into the classroom, you're trying to capture the main idea, or the, what's the central claim, what's the argument in support of it. And often what gets lost is that really fine-grained detail, by which you sort that out in the first place. And so I found, it's really good to get a mix in the classroom anyway of that more general take on a text and what are the big issues it raises, but then just get in there at the sentence level. I mean, really stop, read a sentence. What did that say? Tell me what that said. How does that reflect the bigger idea? Mm-hmm. Why does that next sentence follow? What's the idea, the thread of the idea that connects those two things? And really and maybe do that for a paragraph and just spend an entire class on a paragraph and just sort of show how that process goes, from the point of view of a working scholar.
And just to add to that, I think just like practicing in class on less formal texts, I find to be really useful, right? Because I think that, even just like looking at a paragraph in class, or a text, right, that still feels very academic. But like, I love showing commercials to my students, and I think that's easy in a women, gender, sexuality studies classroom. But as you're thinking about identity, this is being represented constantly. And I think, students do this intuitively. They do analyze commercials. They do analyze what they're seeing, right? We all do. And I think because they are so short, or like, a clip of something, but just like thinking about what we notice about visual images. It's like, I just showed some Viagra commercials to my masculinity students last week, right? And it's just like, well, why is the Viagra framed as a horse? Like, what can we think about that, And there's a cowboy, and there's and it's dragging his broken truck, like, so like, how is this, yeah, it's...
Why?
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. But I feel like stuff like that, right? Like, it also reminds you that analysis is fun, that it's like actually a really pleasurable activity that we do constantly, and that there doesn't, and then I think, and then when we get to sort of like analyzing texts or sort of broader academic, conversations, I can say, like, we've been doing this all semester, right? Like, we've been modeling this all semester long. Just do with this text what we did with that commercial. Just do with that text what we did, when we had the conversation about X, Y, or Z, more informal thing. And I think just, like, demystifying it in that way is really useful.
Yeah, I totally agree that having out of, non-traditional text is important. I've done something different this semester than I've ever done, which was to have groups every other week that analyze according to the theme of the week, right? And so they take something, right? So this week we happen to be dealing with kind of Caribbean literature, Trinidad and Tobago, and thinking about kind of the erotic through Audre Lorde, but some other places as well, Lyndon Gill. And one of the small mentions in a chapter was Calypso Rose, which you may remember from Coachella, opened to Coachella this year. 79-year-old Trinidadian woman who now lives in New York, right? But singer. And she has all these kind of like queer sexual overlays 50 years ago, right? And so they did this presentation talking about 50 years ago Calypso Rose, because that's what the chapter was about how she was the queen of Calypso, right? And then at the end, they showed one little clip of her 79-year-old self talking about gender hierarchies and saying, since I was a kid, I have been, better than Ben at this, right? And so I asked them, I said, so let's talk about what it would mean to think about how age is performing, right, in this performance, right? How does it still work within your definition of eroticism, or does this not work, right? What are the erotics of, the 78-year-old that are not the erotics of the 28-year-old when she started, right? So 50 years difference. Do you still, like, earlier you all were talking about whole discourse, right? And the Black grotesque, but somehow when you got to your grandmother, you couldn't talk about whole discourse and the Black grotesque anymore, right? It was like, oh, no longer is she operating in whole discourses because you only think of that for college students? I'm like, come on, people, like, you know, grandma still got a groove on, right? And so how do we get students to kind of do even more deep dives into what might be not their first thought about an image or a video?
Pose your question, young man.
Yeah, so I completely agree with your point that in order to write a good research paper, you have to familiarize yourself with the topic as much as possible through like extensive reading and stuff. But say that we're writing a primary text research paper, which basically asks you to focus on one text. Like how might you approach that? Because like I suppose you can treat this text as some sort of topic and find some secondary sources, but that's not always the case. Say that you happen to pick something, you know, like very few people actually studied before, and there are not many, you know, secondary sources ready for you to access. Like how might you approach that?
Is that?
Dylan or Cynthia, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I can try. I mean, I think I know what you're talking about because I think I know what the assignment is, but I'm not entirely sure. What I think if you can't find sources that deal with the text as text, you could certainly find sources that deal with the themes that are in the text, right? I mean, that's one of the main things to go. And as far as I know, you guys are encouraged to use whatever approach you want. So the one you're suggesting that isn't there is like the straight literary critical one, right? The one about the text that's written by literary critics. But if you're interested in something sociological about the text, or you're interested in something historical about the text, there's lots of other things you can look for, right? Like, you could look at reviews when the book came out. You could look at sociological accounts of the phenomenon that the book is about. So there's a bunch of different ways you could try to bring things in. You could also try to find out biographical information about the author, or current contemporary analogs for what the book is about, or the short story, or whatever it is you're dealing with. So I feel like I do hear where you're coming from, but I also think that there's a wealth of slightly adjacent things that could still be applied to the text, depending on what your interest is. And there's also the case you could do more general, you know, if the literature comes from a particular, you know, like ethnic group or a nation state or something like that, you could read the more general histories or sort of an introduction to that and try to fit that text in, right? Does that make sense? I mean, is that sort of the question you're asking? Okay, so those are my ideas, but I think there's a lot of other stuff that can be brought to bear on a piece of writing depending on what you want to pull out of it. So,
And just a clarification, is this on? Just a clarification question. Is this a research assignment that you're describing, or is it a different type of assignment? Because that it seems like that might also shape.
It's a writing assignment, yeah.
Okay, but it's not a.
it's the final paper.
It's a close reading that turns into a research assignment. That's what it is.
Okay,
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Interesting.
No, I mean, I was wanting to put it in one of the two categories, and now I'm confounded. So, yeah, because I guess if you.
Just like your
Thanks,
student.
Cynthia. Professor Barunas was astounded by your assignment too.
Yeah, well, I think it just, because I think part of my advice earlier was based on like, okay, like how do you know, if you're formulating a research question and this is a research assignment, then you know it's about the field. If it's a close reading, it feels like a slightly different animal. But of course, I think it's an interesting.
It's a primary text based,
Yeah.
rather than research question based.
Yeah.
assignment.
Can I jump in? Because this is exactly what I did in my research. Is that literally I took texts that no one had written about in that form. Other people had talked about them, and they'd said, oh yeah, this thing exists. So there was plenty of that, but there was no one who had looked at them as that text. And did two things. In part, did an analysis of what do they say and how do they say it that is different? And then looked at where they came from. How the hell did we get these weird texts that don't fit into any proper place? And then what do they do that other texts couldn't? So in part it's a formal analysis. What does this, because I look at pamphlets that are ephemera, it's just the best stuff ever. And why was the form, this weird thing that no one else really cared about, enabling other things? So that there are so many ways you can look at a text. What it says, what it looks like, how it relates to other things, how it looks like might enable it to do. And that's what I mean by dig in. Like, there's so many things you can do once you have something in front of you. All of them are open options, particularly if you have a variety of disciplinary structures at your disposal. So that one of the things that I talk about a lot with students, and this wasn't quite one of your questions, but I think that it might be tangentially relevant, is that what we are asking you to do, and this is my dean hat on, I didn't tell you that at the beginning, I also advise students to think about things like your major, but when you pick your major is in potentially signing up for a toolkit, a way of answering questions, because the questions are topically very similar across disciplines, but the tools you use to answer them can be very different. And so being aware that some tools will enable some kinds of answers, where other tools will enable different kinds of answers, and knowing that if you want to really answer a question, you actually need a whole shit ton of tools.
Let's see, we have two hands in the back. Let's go with the young lady, and then let's go with Jack next.
That's you, Megan.
What kind of events do you see that are kind of changing how we as a society view identity, or perhaps like exemplify how like we see identity, or like exemplify how we see identity as like changing? Or, I don't know.
So this is not so new, but I think that there's a canonical kind of treatment of this, that there's a singular identity, right? That we come to a text. So for example, I gave the story about how I came to talk about black men who have sex with men, who don't identify as being gay, blah, 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 right? But what I didn't talk about, right, on one level I was talking about myself, right? I didn't identify with bisexual, gay, right? But I also grew up in Chicago. And I also grew up using the party line that many of these men were using, right? I also grew up on the south side of Chicago and the west side of Chicago, right? And so the multiple identities. I also grew up, in a two-parent family, right? Like all this stuff, and many of the men with whom I spoke had two-parent, right? But these are multiple identities that are informing how I go about doing this work. And then the last piece I would say is I also grew up in the academy learning queer theory, right? So even as I have this way of thinking that's very indigenous and very of like the city, I'm also being informed by all this new discourses talking about, polysemousness and plurality and, not identity, but identities, right? And so I'm sitting here wondering, my read of these men is totally different and informed by folks who have already done the work and said, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, those are incomplete in covering the territory. And so in some ways I could then position these men as doing something kind of like nouveau riche, if you will, right? Where they actually are, articulating identity on their terms. That says, forget what you heard. This identity category stuff actually doesn't work. So it's jiving with queer theory in this way. And so that's one of the ways I would respond to your
Before we get to Jack's question, which will be the last question of the afternoon here, I want to apologize for projecting an identity upon you. I have no idea how you go about identifying yourself, and that's one of the things I'm trying to police myself on. So please allow me to extend my apology towards you. Okay, Jack, what you got?
I guess my question is, so like, if I'm not mistaken, what I got is that when we're doing our research, that we should be more narrow with our topic. And I'm kind of like, okay, I can be more narrow, but then if I'm more narrow, I'm almost like subconsciously worried, like, can I still like discuss at length about the topic? Like, it's very easy to be broad and like a sweeping stroke, and to be very pinpoint and narrow. And I guess that's why I feel like, my question is like, how do you find the balance of like being narrow, not using too much of the source, and like using your own words while still, you know, hitting that 10-page count?
I knew it was coming. I knew it was coming.
Like, how do you find the balance in the research phase?
All right, I was the one who said be narrow.
Yeah, that's your fault.
It's totally my fault. It was Rachel Slaughter, she just left a comment that I actually think answers it. That what do we do when we analyze something? I totally get 10 pages sounds really scary. And how are you gonna do 10 pages when you're supposed to look at something little? You could just say the thing and then you're done. But when you say the thing, there are a bunch of assumptions built into that. Could you tell me what those assumptions are? And those assumptions perhaps will answer some questions, but raise other ones. Could you address some of those questions? One of the ways that I think that, and what my answer to Professor Slaughter's question would have been, ask yourself why 16 to 24 times. Those are very specific numbers, 16 to 24 times. And that if you keep asking yourself why, or I'm happy to lend you my almost 3-year-old to ask you why, he's very good at it. Professor Brunas over here has an almost 3-year-old as well. I'm sure that we have enough to go around. Professor McCune, also slightly older, could give you some answers to the why. But if you ask why, you will potentially get better questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think, do you all know the Nicki Minaj video, Anaconda?
Oh my God, yes.
I play this video every semester in class because I think it's really great. And one of my favorite papers I've ever read was just about bananas.
Yep.
Just about the bananas. There's so much to say about the bananas. And if you have not seen the video, might I recommend watching this video and think about the paper you could write about bananas. Does that answer your question?
I'm gonna follow up with that and say, yesterday we had a conversation. I challenged you to pay attention to yourself and to analyze yourself. Get to know yourself, perhaps it will begin to expose some of the areas that you are interested in researching, all right? All right.
Can I just ask one more thing? Like, I also think that the question of intimacy is important, right? I think that we don't talk enough about, like, how do we often think of distance, and I like that sometimes. But I also think, what does it mean to be intimate with the text that you're engaging with, right? Like, what questions do you ask of folks you're intimate with, right? But not just romantically. It can be romantically too, because I love some of the work I do. I do fall in love with some of the subject matter, right? I had to fall in love with Kanye and fall out of love with him at the same time, right? And that requires me asking some questions, right? Like, why would he make a move like this in 2003 and not make the same move in 2019, right? Like, so you're asking these different questions intimately in ways. What does Chicago have to do with it? Well, I love Chicago so much that I read Chicago on a Kanye in ways that New Yorkers and Texans and other folks do not read, right? And so my generous reading is all about my intimacy, not just with Kanye, but with the text and with Chicago and with the context of Chicago, which is the United States, blah, 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 right? And so I think that's one way to get narrower and narrower, is to just get more intimate and intimate and intimate with the thing that you're engaging.
Well, thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Can we give a round of applause to our panelists?